In this module, we're going to take a look at the psychology of human learning. And in this video specifically, we're going to take a look at what is known as classical conditioning. And our goals in this video are to answer the questions, what is learning? Or how do we learn? Or is there more than one way to learn? Now, more often than not, when we think about learning, we think of this. We think of opening a book and reading words until we gain new knowledge. Or we think of this. We may be looking at, thinking of it as sitting in a classroom while the teacher basically grinds up knowledge and then pours it into our brains. But learning actually happens in more ways than these. So let's take a look at it. Let's just define what learning is. And a good formal definition is learning refers to a relatively enduring change in behavior or knowledge as a result of experience. Now you notice I put the important things that you need to focus on in order to really understand this and memorize this information. I put it in red for you. So those are the areas that you really need to pay attention to. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to look at what's known as classical conditioning. But what is conditioning? Well, the definition of conditioning is the process of learning associations between environmental events and behavioral responses. And there are three types of conditioning. They are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. And here are the three types, roughly defined and illustrated here. So classical conditioning, remember on the left here, we're taking a look right here, and classical conditioning, that is when a neutral stimulus is associated with a natural response. Now we're going to take a look at this more in depth, so do not worry about trying to memorize this as we're doing this. And in the middle, right there, the middle image is what's called operant conditioning. That's a response is increased or decreased due to reinforcement or punishment. And last but not least, on the far right, we're going to take a look at what's called observational learning. And that's when the learning that occurs through observation and imitation of others. Now, as I said, in this video, we are mostly concerned with what's known as classical conditioning. So what is classical conditioning and how did it come to be? In classical conditioning, they say that that's the basic learning process that involves repeatedly pairing a neutral stimulus with a response-producing stimulus until the neutral stimulus elicits the same response. Now, I realize that is kind of a complex definition. So do not worry, we're going to take a look at this a little more in depth as we proceed. Now, classical conditioning says it was discovered by Ivan Pavlov while he was studying digestion. And now he was a physiologist in the mid 1800s to the early 1900s. Now, what Pavlov is mostly known for is in classical conditioning was the salivating dog experiment. And so what this is here, we're going to take a look at this step by step, and this is understanding the steps involved in classical conditioning. So on the top left frame right here, that says before conditioning, what Pavlov would do is he would have food, and then he noticed that as he was feeding the dogs, that those dogs would automatically salivate. So the food, that was known as the unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned meaning basically untrained. And same with the dog's response when it was salivating, that was the untrained response. Those were naturally occurring. That's another way to think of those terms. So there's a stimulus and then there's a response. Now let's look in frame 2. So before the conditioning right here, Pavlov thought, well, okay, so if the dog is naturally salivating to food, what would happen if I started to use a neutral stimulus such as a whistle? And so he would blow the whistle, and then he would observe the dog's response, and there was actually no conditioned response. It was not salivating or anything. So that was not a naturally occurring response. The dog would just basically look at him and with no response whatsoever. But then Pavlov got the idea. He said, well, how about if during the conditioning phase right here in frame number 3, right before the dog is about to eat the food, I blow the whistle, then serve the food while the dog is salivating and waiting to eat the food. And he would continue to do this repeatedly until eventually in frame number 4, it got to the point where the sound of the whistle would elicit the same response as the food, but this time the food was not in the picture. So Pavlov would blow the whistle and then the dog would salivate. So that became known as, the whistle became known as the conditioned stimulus. And then the dog's salivation would be known as what's called the conditioned response. Now, why? Well, look above right in frame number 2 again. You remember, if you look at that a little more closely, the whistle in frame number 2, before the conditioning occurred, the whistle was called the neutral stimulus. And the salivation, since there was no salivation, there was no response at all. But if you look down on frame number 4, after the conditioning, the dog became conditioned to the sound of the whistle and therefore would salivate. Now, what is interesting is Pavlov's experiments and research was mostly concerned with animals, so animal behavior. And so this gentleman right here, John Watson, he actually was inspired by Pavlov's experiments, but he wanted to apply that to humans. And so that approach, applying those new behavioral type of conditioning approaches to humans, formed a new approach called behaviorism. Now, behaviorism, that was concerned with the scientific study of objectively observed behavior. So that's what's key to know here, is objectively observed behavior, because behaviorists felt that psychology should be concerned only with observing behavior, because that's what could be objectively observed and even measured at times. Whereas things like cognitive processes and things they felt, could not be observed directly. And further, Watson believed that all human behavior is the result of conditioning and learning. And down below here at the very bottom, you'll see it says that he conducted the controversial case of little Albert. So we'll take a brief look at what that was. And on the top here, before condition, little Albert was a young child that what they would do is expose him to this little white rat right here. And at first, there would be no response for little Albert. He wasn't conditioned. There was no fear whatsoever to the white rats. He would smile and exhibited curiosity. Now, one thing they did test, is still in the before conditioning phase, is they would hit a steel bar with a hammer, and the loud clanging sound would actually elicit the natural reflex in little Albert, which would make him cry. He would have fear, and that was a natural reflex. Now, during condition, they combined the two of those. So they would have the white rat come near little Albert, and then as little Albert was looking at the white rat, they would bang the steel bar against that with a hammer again, making the loud sound, which would elicit that same response, the fear and the crying. And as you see here, those are all unconditioned responses. Those are naturally occurring responses to the loud sounds. Now, after conditioning, though, they found that the white rat became a conditioned stimulus. And because little Albert associated the white rat with the sound of the steel bar being hit with a hammer, little Albert would automatically cry and have fear as a result of looking at the white rat, even without the sound of the hammer hitting the bar. And so hence, down at the bottom right, the far right, he started developing a conditioned response to the white rat. Now, just one last example of classically conditioned effect. Here, something that a lot of us, especially adults and students, that we're very familiar with is just the smell of coffee can actually increase our sense of arousal and alertness. And so this chart right here demonstrates how, at first, things like the smell and taste of coffee and caffeine itself, those are unconditioned stimuli. And they elicit an unconditioned response because those are naturally occurring. Now, after conditioning, though, the smell and taste of coffee, it actually elicits a conditioned reflex and or conditioned response, and that is called was the increased arousal and alertness. And that is why often, even as the coffee is brewing and we're smelling it in the morning, we start to feel like we're waking up, even though it's known that caffeine usually takes at least 20 minutes to get in our system and actually start to increase our alertness and our arousal. So I know that's a lot of material explained rather quickly. So take a breath, stay calm, keep calm, and we're just going to practice a couple of examples and questions here just to try to help you to become more familiar with this material. So here's a question. So learning may be defined as blank change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. So what do you think? So pause for a moment, choose what you think might be the correct answer, and we'll proceed to the next frame. So the answer is relatively permanent. So learning may be defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Let's look at another question here. So the best description for the unconditioned stimulus is, and I will have you pause the video, look at each of these, and choose which you feel might be the correct answer. So the answer is A, a stimulus that automatically elicits a response. So that's the best description for the unconditioned stimulus. It's the stimulus that automatically elicits a response. And the term there is automatically. That is automatic, does not need to be conditioned or trained. That's why they call it the unconditioned stimulus. Now, one more question. So in Pavlov's experiment, what was considered the unconditioned response? Now, take a moment, consider this question, and look at the words carefully because they're saying unconditioned response. So pause the video, choose your answer, and when you do, when you come back, go to the next frame. Okay, so the answer is salivation. So in Pavlov's experiment, salivation was considered the unconditioned response. It was the naturally occurring response to the meat powder. And so that is all for this video. So I would like to remind you the next step is to download the learning worksheet that I put in the link underneath this video and fill out the answers. And in class, we will go over those together. And thank you for your participation.